Welcome to Seeing Jesus with Paul Miller. I'm Liz Voberil, and I'm here with Robert Rowe, who directs our student ministry, and Paul himself. This ministry, seeJesus, creates discipleship tools and trains people in how to use them. Many organizations do important work helping the church be the hands and feet of Jesus, but seeJesus works on the imagination and the heart. We want to help the church rediscover the beauty of Jesus and catch a vision to live as he lived. If you've been following our podcast, you know we've been in a series where we're looking particularly at Jesus in his passion towards the end of his life. And we've been appreciating that the intensity of the moment just brings some of these things we've seen in Jesus all along. It just bumps them up, a higher contrast. You can see it more clearly. So as we move into this episode, Paul, how would you frame where we're going in this conversation?
Well, why don't we answer that question, Liz, by actually just diving in. So we're going to talk about sighing. It's just
not like, for the whole episode, though. I promise.
But we'll because so we were talking last time about anxiety, and some of us on the episode were troubled, and some of us were agitated. So but now we're going to move from that to sighing. And so we have a couple examples of Jesus sighing that where there's a clear kind of references to that. So Liz, go ahead.
Sure. This is from Mark 7, verse 31 to 35. Then Jesus left the vicinity of Tyre and went through Sidon, down to the Sea of Galilee and into the region of the Decapolis. There some people brought to him a man who was deaf and could hardly talk, and they begged him to place his hand on the man. After he took him aside, away from the crowd, Jesus put his fingers into the man's ears. Then he spit and touched the man's tongue. He looked up to heaven and with a deep sigh said to him, "Ephphatha," which means be opened. At this, the man's ears were opened, his tongue was loosened, and he began to speak plainly.
Isn't that beautiful? It really is. It's just amazing passage. And you know, we're in the disability world, and this passage has a lot to do with Kim, our daughter, because she's mute. And so we are very aware of his power. And what God has done with Kim. She has an electronic voice, and she loves to sing. She loves to sign. So we have done our fair of sign times, and it's just such a, I don't know, it's just such a, it shows you that his miracles weren't mechanical.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Any thoughts on that, either of you?
No, Paul, it does pose a question for me, just kind of your journey of sighing, the deep sighs at the beginning with Kim, and then, probably still sighs, along the way. And even now, I had never kind of put this story and your story together until you just said that.
He's feeling the fall, it's not just something theological or academic. And it's just such a beautiful way of imitating Jesus. Liz?
I'm thinking I feel like sighs, you think in a family context, right? The teenage daughter sighs when mom asks her to put her plate in the dishwasher from the table. I feel like sighs.
Now you've connected with Robert's world.
I feel like sighing is you're frustrated with the management kind of a vibe. And so it's interesting because I think of it as and here, Jesus sort of, we have that classic problem of, but he is he's on the management team. He's right. It's but it doesn't, I appreciate what you're drawing our attention to, Paul, right? Because it's it's not okayness of the problem here. And so the sigh comes, right? And it's not disrespectful to the management. It's not the way that sometimes the sigh about the dish might be. But it is an honest reflection of the problem.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not the sigh of my, if you want to know what a sigh is, you just watch a 13-year-old girl to express her disdain for certain things. That's one level of sighing. It's like Jesus has this level of sighing that's like the entire created order that he sees that has been marred by sin and death. And it's just this deep well of a sense of this. I love that sighing is like this nonverbal attempt to express a level of grief that you're feeling, and that the gospel writers give us an insight into that. It's really cool.
Yeah, it's really there is a kind of a beauty to it. It's so, and this is a theme. It's so unplastic. It's just so that we never handle the things of God separate from the what these things feel like, and to be able to, it shows that he's completely engaged with this healing. It's not kind of Max Lucado. I have probably read every other book on Jesus that I could get my whole hand on in the last 30 years. So I'd read popular stuff like Max Lucado. You pick up little nuances. And he writes about this scene. From the depths of his being, Jesus' being, came a rush of emotions that said more than words. A hybrid of frustration and sadness between a fit of anger and a burst of tears, which I think you were grappling towards that, Liz. It's just so real. And he's showing us to be human. Let's go to the next sigh, Liz, which is right. Yeah. So that was Mark 7. This is right a few paragraphs later.
Okay, Mark 8:11-13. The Pharisees came and began to question Jesus. To test him, they asked him for a sign from heaven. He sighed deeply and said, "Why does this generation ask for a miraculous sign? I tell you the truth, no sign will be given to it." Then he left them, got back into the boat, and crossed to the other side.
And again, so here's another sigh, and it doesn't come through in the ESV, but this second sigh is more deep than the first. The first one is he sighed, and then the second one is he sighed deeply. And the ESV is trying to convey that first one was pretty strong too, but this one is stronger. And I do like like a sigh. It just says so much. It's interesting. Even the Spirit, we know from Romans 8, is sighing.
Yeah. I was thinking about that groaning with words that cannot express.
About that groaning with words. And a sigh expresses things that, like you said, Liz, that words can't quite capture. And and you can see why it's interesting to look at that is the sigh if we think of there's two sides of evil, the grip of evil on our world. Well, there's a third side, which is Satan is the ruler of this present age. And then but there's two ways that we encounter all the time is the impact of the fall, and that is sin, and the other one is death. And Paul will put those together. So death would be the way it's affected the nature of the created order, that death haunts everything. Death, sickness. Go ahead.
In this one, the interaction with the deaf man is death, the impact of death.
Yeah.
And the Pharisees here would be sin. Is that
right? Or
yeah.
you could say the physical order and the created order. I'm
Yeah.
sure that theologians have more sophisticated. I mean, the created order and the moral order, or the So Kim's, in fact, that was a big question growing up for Kim, which is like Jill, which she would get so angry so much of the time, but we didn't know Jill would pray constantly trying to sort out what can she do, what can't she do, and what won't she do.
Yep.
So Jill was trying to sort out, in effect, what's sin and what's death.
Yep.
And any parent is that, like when you're
developmental stages, right? Involve like what can't they, what won't they? Yeah.
Right. So like when you're familiar when you're bringing a toddler home late at night when you've been out way too late and they're screaming, hopefully as a parent, you don't discipline them in any kind of way at that point, because they're just, the physical stuff has overwhelmed them, which has then invaded the moral side, and they're saying, they're behaving badly, but because they're, that's what we were facing this morning in front of the TV. It was sin and death in microcosm. And, so it's just beautiful that, so it's interesting of those two that affect Jesus the most, that moral order, the Pharisees, they're demanding, testing him. They're looking at his face, looking at his miracles. They're seeing him. Like the fact that he's divine is just screaming by his miracles. And yet they're sitting there judging him. And it just breaks his heart. Like he's feeling their judging. Why does this generation ask for a sign? I'm sure that sigh permeated even that question. It's just kind of a groan,
right.
Well,
and
why?
even I feel like the verse 13, then he left them, got back in the boat and crossed to the other side. I'm like, even that kind of putting that kind of distance feels like it's part of, it shows us the strength of his feeling, right? That he's not, he goes a whole different direction. I mean, that's where he was going anyway, but he's clearly out of there.
That's right. Yeah. And this question from the Pharisees is satanic. It's a demonic question, because we know that because it's a repeat of the temptation of Satan. When Satan is tempting Jesus to act on his own outside of the will of his Father. Another way of putting it, it's a temptation to do a miracle for show. And I tell you, that temptation bedevils the church. Absolutely bedevils the church. Because it's a temptation to use my teaching gifts or the success of my ministry to, in some ways, boast of our church or our mission, or in some ways, magnify what we're doing, because it separates what it does, the temptation, it separates love from power. And that Jesus will not use his power to protect himself or to separate it from love. His power is never for himself. That's why he won't get off the cross. Because he won't. So they want. So the sign. I should explain what a sign is. Like, because we know there's references to them in the Talmud. It might mean, like some rabbi would say, another rabbi to prove he's a rabbi by making the room expand 10 feet or something like that. Like it's a miracle for show. Like jumping off the temple, is a miracle for show. It's something spectacular that helps people to see that you're an amazing person. And he so hates pride and the thought of pride. He's just disgusted at it. And it is also demonic. And almost always when you see often a good and great leader fall, they have said yes to this temptation. Here's a quick example of that. I've said this before, but it says it fits, is in Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov. He has a chapter, the Grand Inquisitor, and Jesus has returned to, it's a parable. It's incredible. I've read it 5 or 6 times. It's just unbelievable. And Jesus has returned to 16th century Spain, and he's doing miracles. And the cardinal, who's the head of the Inquisition, knows it's Jesus, and he has Jesus jailed. And Jesus never says a word in the whole chapter, in the whole parable. Most of the chapter is the cardinal interrogating, telling him that he missed an opportunity with Satan, and the church has discovered what Jesus missed. That people really want show, and they really want bread, and that Jesus didn't give them bread, but the church is going to satisfy them. So the institutional church is going to be their savior. It is so convicting. It's a unbelievable parable on this, and it gives you a feel for why Jesus is recoiling from this evil.
I'm just thinking, have just my own heart a little bit, how often my sighs are related to my personal affliction,
right?
Or how they've impacted me. I do have. It seems like the older I get, my sighs are related more towards the pain of others and the pain of sin and death in the world. But for so long, and still, how much of the disturbance of my soul is because I'm personally going through some kind of affliction, and it makes me sigh. So I long for the holiness of Jesus to sigh at the things that he sighed at.
Well, I do see you sigh in a good way, Robert, at the church not seeing the person of Jesus. You will sigh quite a bit about that, and that's a good sigh. Let me close up this idea of this 2 faces of sin, which is the moral, the way, the 2 faces of evil. One is the moral face, and the other is the physical face in death. And it's interesting that the J curve, which is, of course, the cross, the death and resurrection, let's call it the original, as opposed to our J curve. So there's a lot, interesting lineup between those two. So the cross deals with sin and everything related to sin, and the resurrection deals with death. So it's the 1-2 punch. So Jesus, and it's interesting to see in Jesus' ministry, his healing ministry is all focused on some impact of the curse on our physical world and our bodies. And his teaching ministry is focused on the impact of sin. So both of them anticipate the final solution, which is the cross and resurrection. And both of them, the church continues on, both the teaching and the healing ministry of Christ. So it's imperative that we be doing both. So we're continuing on. So those 2 ministries culminated in his death and then resurrection. And now as a church, we're continuing to live out those 2 ministries of Christ.
Yeah, it strikes me that those 2, it's also an honest reaction to the world we live in. Those 2, to see those 2 problems. We talk about the honesty of Jesus, right? And even for the church to be honest about where the world we live in, it requires an honest acknowledgement of both kinds of, which again, pushing against the stoic kind of reaction that just always says rise above or sort of deny those things. There's an honesty to engaging those 2 hard things with truth.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, why don't we look at the last incident? We were looking at some of Jesus' emotions here. Although we come to them in John 11,
Yep.
At Lazarus' tomb.
When Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. "Where have you laid him?" he asked. "Come and see, Lord," they replied. Jesus wept. Then the Jews said, "See how he loved him." But some of them said, "Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying?" Jesus, once more deeply moved, came to the tomb. It was a cave with a stone laid across its entrance. "Take away the stone," he said. "But Lord," said Martha, the sister of the dead man, "by this time there is a bad odor, for he has been there 4 days." Then Jesus said, "Did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God?" So they took away the stone. Then Jesus looked up and said, "Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe that you sent me." When he had said this, Jesus called in a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." The dead man came out, his hands and feet wrapped with strips of linen and a cloth around his face. Jesus said to them, "Take off the grave clothes and let him go."
This is absolutely spectacular. I mean, it's just, I was so excited. So just last week we watched this on The Chosen season 4. I was just really curious to see, and it's so hard to convey this stuff, but I thought they did a really good job of conveying the different pieces of it. Although the one piece they didn't convey, because I think it's so hard to convey, and our translations don't like, is that there are 2 references that are clear as a bell in here that Jesus was angry. And so in verse 33, I'll read it. When Jesus saw her weeping and the Jews who came along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. And that deeply moved is anger. And German translations, I'm curious as to what other translation, I just looked it up. So German translations pick up the anger. English translations don't. And I don't know if that comes from the British stoicism or sort of a classic stiff upper lip and then the other reference down in verse 38. So then he has this, then he weeps, and there's this people around him, and they're walking, probably happens as they're walking to the grave. And then verse 38, Jesus, once more deeply moved, came to the tomb. And that deeply moved there is deeply angry, once more angry. And in fact, Warfield translation, this is from Warfield's The Emotional Life of Our Lord, which is a wonderful essay. He deeply moved, she said, should be translated as enraged. So Jesus isn't feeling uncontrollable grief, but irresistible anger.
And Paul, just that anger, it's at we were just talking about the death problem, right? Like the fall, the fact that death happens, right? Not at how the people are grieving or any of those. So it's not it's not necessarily toward the people. It's really at death itself.
Yeah. And Warfield points out that he's angry at death and what it does to people, and he's angry at Satan behind this. And in the ancient world, you see this true in the modern world. The soldiers would work themselves up into kind of a frenzy, like that chant that they have in the that's really popular in rugby. Liz, I don't know if you've been watched much rugby lately.
I didn't realize you had, Paul.
And it comes out of New Zealand, but it was this would be sort of an ancient warrior chant. And you'll see some movies will pick it up, and they would work themselves. The Vikings would do this. They were known for that. There's this a battle before the Battle of Hastings in England. That one Viking warrior who was a kind of in a frenzy held off the entire British army for like a half hour because he was at this. They couldn't get by him with his battle axe. And what Warfield says is that Jesus isn't going. He's not going to his death passively, sort of stoically doing his job. That he's an ancient warrior. He is, and his anger is focused at Satan. So it's not a stoic. I mean, it's really the stoicism that has shut down some of our, like he's not stoic as he's going towards that tomb and doing this miracle. It's probably not the only incident where Jesus was angry at this. We have the very first miracle in Mark, no translations pick it up. A couple do. He mentions his anger when he heals a leper, and it's very incongruous. And I think because we like our sadness and anger in separate buckets, we don't like this.
Yeah, which is the wonder of this scene is that there is a reality to this, how he is incarnating with his friends and the loss that they're grieving, and he sees them weeping and he begins to weep. And at the same time, this champion going to a tomb to overcome sin and death. I think my favorite part of, this story is fascinating. I mean, it's just wonderful to watch Jesus in this moment. But one of my favorite parts of it is that John points out that he said with a loud voice, Lazarus, come out. So you can almost, in our, I don't know how The Chosen did. I hadn't seen this episode, but, you could see kind of this Lazarus, come forth, or like, but when you pick up all these emotions of sadness and anger at sin and death and at Satan, I think it's just this bellowing voice of Jesus that commands death. You won't have a hold anymore. Almost like Gandalf and when the dragon's coming across the bridge and he sticks his staff on the ground and he says, you shall not pass. It's like a sense of which I get Jesus at the tomb right here.
Yeah. That's great, Robert.
Yeah, there are many scenes like that I wish pastors would call men to the greatness of this kind of standing up against evil. And again, it needs to be done wisely and compassionately and thoughtfully. It's not like you're isolating it, but this one strand of what it is to be a human, it really, like Aragon at the Black Gate. So if you've not read the books, the Lord of the Rings trilogy, he says, as they're completely surrounded, he says, and just before the attack of these orc hordes, Aragon says the day, I'm going to get it wrong here. The day may come when the courage of men may fail, but not this day. This day we fight. And it's just that calling men, I'm going to direct this to men, just calling men to the greatness of the battle and make sure you're not battling in the flesh. You know what I mean? It means you gotta, the only way to battle in the spirit is to be in prayer. Often, a lot of our problems because we enter into the wrong battles. So I'm not saying any of that macho stuff, but this call to just a really godly manhood, which you see all through the Gospels, of the power of a holy life engaged with evil.
Yeah. Which, I mean, that makes me come back to imagination, right? Like, some of that is, we're talking about these stories in movies because they capture our imaginations with something that we often miss in these stories because of what we bring into them. Or like Robert, your Jesus gone British and kind of royal version of calling him out of the tomb. But so it's like, how do you get an imagination, like hearing these stories afresh in ways that do expand our imagination to where it should be.
Yeah.
I mean, by the words of the second person of the Trinity, I mean, in an instant, death is no more. Like, life comes back. Like, it's just an insanely powerful moment to realize what has just happened. And sometimes we get lost in the reality of what's really taking place at the tomb here.
A friend of mine who's Greek Orthodox told me recently that the reason where it was a reminder of something. He just put things together that was very much of the Eastern Church mind. He said, the reason why he wasn't. I'll just apply his insight to this incident. The reason that that this is effortless for Jesus is that Jesus is the Logos. Like, he is he's in and behind and sustaining everything at this point. So that's why it's effortless for him to command the wind and the waves, is because they actually listen in a mysterious way to their creator. The cells obey because it's the original voice that made them.
Oh, that's beautiful, Paul. Yeah.
Liz, could you close by reading Warfield's comments?
Sure.
There, it's a long section, him describing this passage. It's just one of my favorite. I think how many times I've read this.
The spectacle of distress of Mary and her companions enraged Jesus because it brought poignantly home to his consciousness the evil of death, its unnaturalness, its violent tyranny. He contemplates the general misery of the whole human race and burns with rage against the oppressor of men. Inextinguishable fury seizes upon him. His whole being is discomposed and perturbed. It is death that is the object of his wrath, and behind death, him who has the power of death, and whom he has come into the world to destroy. Tears of sympathy may fill his eyes, but this is incidental. His whole soul is held by rage, as a champion who prepares for conflict. What John does for us in this particular statement is to uncover to us the heart of Jesus as he wins for us our salvation, not in cold unconcern, but in flaming wrath against the foe. Jesus smites in our behalf. He has not only saved us from the evils which oppress us, he has felt for and with us in our oppression, and under the impulse of these feelings has wrought out our redemption.
Isn't that amazing? I said that was going to be closing, but it reminded me of B.B. Warfield's life. His wife became a partial invalid during his honeymoon. As a young man, they got caught in a lightning storm, and and she had some kind of brain damage. She could function, you know what I mean? But it was hard for her to invite people in. We could have actually probably helped her with some of our modern medicines. So he spent his whole life entering into the sufferings of Christ, of another person. And Warfield is probably the first modern scholar, along with Edersheim, who really gets the person of Jesus. And, you just can't get this unless you enter into his sufferings and then his resurrection.
Yeah, amen.
All right. Well, I think that's as far as we can go today. Thank you guys for listening. Thank you, Paul, Robert, for the conversation. We'll be back in a couple of weeks with another.